Hello, all. Welcome. Um, we're just gonna let Zoom do its thing where it's accepts all the people in the waiting room one at a time. So while you are coming in, I'm going to give a little bit of a few updates on some things that are coming up with us, some opportunities, and then I will turn it over to these lovely folks that you are here to see. My name is Sarah Getz. I am the Collections Programming Manager and Data Associate at Letterform Archive. This is the Salon series. We try to do, roughly monthly, a really cool talk with a really cool person. So join, if you're new to these series, please keep an eye on what we've got coming up. So our next talk is next week. This is a free lecture that is online called The Mysterious Case of the Shapeshifting Poblano Black Letter with Jesus Barrientos Mora. And that is about a 5-century-old Mexican city with an exceptional taste for black letter hybrids. It might be very interesting for folks. Many of you are here because of our current exhibition, Subscription to Mischief, and there's an on-site curator tour with Kate Longsteller on Wednesday, November 1st. So if you are in the Bay Area, please check it out. I've been on one of Kate's tours and it is absolutely lovely. Really interesting, fun, and funny. So next we've got an on-site book launch. Kit Hendricks, the designer Kit Hendricks, is going to have his latest book, talking about the value of storytelling over the course of his career. So the art of storytelling, presentation, and it's a book signing. And our next salon, like I mentioned, this was part of a series, will be with some of the contributors to another recent publication of ours, Die Flagge, Design and Lettering of the Vienna Succession. So if you really like super ornate stuff, this would be a really fun talk to go to. So you would be joining the contributors from this latest book for a visit to Vienna in 1900. Which had an outsized influence on lettering and graphic design. That's with Diane Silverthorne, Dan Reynolds, and Megan Brandel Faller. If you are a knitter and you like to like wool bomb, there's typographic knitting, writing with wool, with Rudger Schlummer. And you can explore basic knitting type knitting techniques and plan your next holiday knitting project using Knit Grotesque and other custom hand knitting fonts. So that's a workshop that starts on November 18th. Finally, especially for those of you who are joining us from all over the place, if you've never gotten to come to Letterform Archive in person and you don't think you are going to get to anytime soon, this might be a good opportunity for you to see what it's like to get a tour of our collection. That's our permanent collection, not just our exhibitions, with our docent cohort who are all over the world and speak more than 15 languages altogether. So if you're curious about us, curious about about what tours are like with us, we do private groups and we do free classes for educational groups. This is a really good place to find out about that. That's on Tuesday, November 21st, all online, and it's at 10 a.m. Pacific, so that we can get some of y'all folks who are in widely different time zones than we are. So if you want to know more about any of those events, please check out letarc.org/events. Just a few other things. If you are interested in getting a certificate in typeface design, the deadline for that application, this is both an online program and there is an on-site program. The application for both of those is on Monday, November 4th, so that's coming up. or November 6th. And if you just want something really beautiful to come to your mailbox, snail mail, it's your last chance to update your mailing address to receive our absolutely gorgeous print newsletter. Our design team has been working real hard on this, and it's very pretty. So if you want a pretty thing, it's free. And then finally, everything that we do is made possible by membership. So please join us at letarc.org/join to be a member, get cool perks, and yeah, just be a pal. So without any further ado, the real reason we're here today is from the source, a conversation with Chino BYI. So I'm going to introduce Kel, who's going to facilitate this conversation. So Kel Troughton is a type designer, a lettering artist, a graffiti writer, and an educator. He works with Letterform Archive and Kate Longsteller, who's also with us today, to collect graffiti magazines, drawings, and books. He started writing graffiti in 2000 and has continued to add interests that are letter related ever since. His company, Overlap Type, focuses on type design that utilizes ideas from his graffiti experience. In short, Kel's a letter person. And without any further ado from me, take it away, Kel. Thank you.
Right on. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, it's kind of funny to get called out or to call myself out for starting writing in 2000 when I'm talking to Chino here, but here we go. So just a little bit of an intro for Chino, and feel free to add if you would like, Dave. So I'm going to be talking today with David Villorente, a graffiti writer and author of a few of the really well-known graffiti books out there, like the Peace Book series and Mascots and Mugs. He's one of the curators of the Beyond the Streets exhibitions that are happening worldwide. He also worked at The Source, which we're going to talk a lot about today, and is the co-curator along with Greg Lamarche, Kate Steller-Long, and myself of the recent and the current Letterform Archive exhibition subscription to Mischief. Yeah, anything I missed, Dave, that you want to call out?
That's about it. Thank you for having me today. Good to see everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, and just for context, right? You said that you felt funny about having started when you started. Mm-hmm. And just for the sake of clarity, depending on where you grew up and when you grew up just sort of determines when you get started. So
True.
It doesn't really, I always feel bad because someone will say like, hey, big fan. And I'm like, do you write graffiti? And then it'll turn into, well, not like you. And I'm just, my point is never minimize your experience, no matter what level you're doing it on. It's a good time. So just, anywho, yes, just wanted to add that. But.
Yeah, fair enough. Thanks. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, I can see everything.
Okay, okay, cool. So I am going to get into questions, and I'm starting here with your business card, but we're going to talk about Source in a little bit. To start this off, I'm going to use a couple spreads from Skills magazine, and we're going to kind of talk about the early days, or your early days, and specifically New York City subway graffiti. So I'm kind of wondering if you have any stories on that end, like how you got started writing on trains, who you were seeing riding around. Yeah, just early days, New York.
It's a very different city today than the city that raised me. The landscape of New York was covered with graffiti. It sort of thrived in all of the spaces that a young person might find themselves in. Staircase, schoolyard, taking the subway home, taking the buses home. But it really did flourish on the subways. There was sort of a conversation going on. Graffiti is a language, and I sort of felt left out. My unsophisticated eye couldn't decipher some of the complicated letter forms I saw on trains. But what really spoke to me were some of the figurative drawings that I saw. Maybe it was Mickey Mouse from Fantasia next to a scene piece, right? Like I couldn't make out the letters because you literally got 60 seconds maybe to catch the train as people are exiting and getting on and off of the subway, and then it's pulling off and you're chasing it down the platform. But it was the characters from popular culture that sort of looked familiar. And it's a scary place when you're a little kid, you know, and you kind of see a character, you know, from the Sunday comics or the Daily News or whatever it is, on the side of a train. So that's probably the first thing that caught my attention. I remember seeing a spy versus spy scenario on the 7 train platform, and I read Mad Magazine. I might have been like 7 or 8 years old, but it was probably one of the first times where I really like stopped to look at something that was written on a wall illegally. And then there was a sort of this fascination about it. Keith Haring was super prolific when I was in junior high school. And I remember asking my mom who that was. And when she explained that one person did all of those drawings illegally, I was fascinated with the notion that this one man was everywhere I went before I arrived. And then, you know, graffiti is sort of a rite of passage in New York, especially during the era that I grew up in. And, you know, I can compare it to skateboarding. Like, you could be a famous graffiti writer and no one knows who you are, but when you're in that space, you're God to them. And it's the same thing with skateboarding. But I think that it's something that, just like skateboarding, everybody tried at some point growing up. Some people tried a little bit longer. Some people actually got decent. A select few actually got great. And a really small handful of people became widely recognized for what they could do on a skateboarder with graffiti. So I think there were a lot of parallels in that sense, but it's something that everyone tried at some point growing up. And probably about the time I was in junior high school, most of the guys that I had bumped into were writing graffiti or tagging. I had relatives that weren't very serious, but I had cousins that were tagging at the time. But probably my freshman year of high school was really the deep dive into meeting guys that were writing on trains that were up on subways. And that was sort of like my formal introduction into writing on trains.
Awesome. So those some of those guys that were maybe taking you out for the first couple times, can you tell me about any of those writers, if anyone's still doing it, especially?
Most of them went to high school with me. And, you know, it's kind of funny. Well, rest in peace, LC was probably one of the first guys that was really adamant about taking me. My buddy Tretch kind of took me under his wing. There was sort of a mentorship program, which I don't know if it still exists today. But more often than not, an older writer would see value in what you were doing, kind of take you under his wing and teach you the ropes. And, you know, at 14 years old, I learned my way around the subway system from a 15-year-old who learned it from another 15-year-old the year before he taught it to me. And I mean, it's such a complicated system down there. There's a live third rail. Most people don't know that there are phones in the tunnels where you can get an outside line and make a phone call. There are emergency hatches. You can turn off the electricity. Not advisable, but you can turn off the electricity in the tracks if you need to. There are fire extinguishers there in case you need to escape in a cloud of smoke. So there were all of these things that I sort of learned from an older graffiti writer who learned them the year before he taught me. But the truth of the matter is, as an adult, I probably know way too much about the inner workings of the subway system than I'm supposed to know. I didn't need a 9-week OSHA safety course. Literally, like, we were learning on the job, and we had 15-year-old kids teaching us the way. But spent a lot of time writing on trains growing up. It was a relatively harmless criminal infraction during the 80s. Like, you could seriously, I didn't get caught a lot, thankfully, but technically you probably could not get in any serious trouble. But yeah, but there was a culture of it, and the guys from high school were they were doing these Saturday matinee things where they would meet at like noon after wrestling, and they would go to like the CC and A tunnels or the GG tunnels in East New York. And it was a bunch of guys I went to school with. And then my buddy Tretch kind of took me under his wing, my buddy Webster, and we started writing together. And I kind of stuck with Tretch. And he was he's the pres of BYI. He was probably my mentor, one of my first graffiti partners. But I learned a great deal about graffiti from him, the schedules and what type of train keys you need for the BMT and IND line. And there were just so many things. Even without a key, I could like lift the door and pull it, the lock off the hinge, kick in the conductor booth in the corner, and in the dark, there's a lump, and the first switch is the light, the second switch is the fan. So now I have light, and it's cooler in the train, and beneath the seats, there are levers that open the doors that are next to them as emergency exits. So there were all of these like interesting tips that we sort of used to our advantage. We were able to make our own train keys, and it was a culture that was like really heavy into DIY. Like we made our own markers. Some people made their own ink. We made our own train keys, made our own fat caps, or racked our own fat caps. All of this stuff is, except for the train keys, are commercially available at your local Blick these days. But most of this stuff were things that we were swiping kitchen and panel magic caps for fat caps, and getting skeleton keys and keeping them straight for IRTs, curving them for the BMT line. And so there were all of these interesting tips that you could only get, and they were well-guarded secrets. Like people weren't willing to put you on. Like it's almost like being an apprentice at a tattoo shop. You're like the first one there, the last one to leave, and none of the work that you do is glamorous. And they give you a really hard time, but if you're devoted or you prove that you're really interested, you'll be rewarded for your devotion or your determination or your talent or for being prolific. There's typically a turning point. But I think in all respective fields, like in the military, and if you're pledging a fraternity, if you're a rookie in the NBA, there's a hazing ritual that's designed to give you a hard time. And I think, in hindsight, it was probably designed to weed out who wasn't serious about it and who was.
Right.
And I think over time, you're just sort of rewarded for being steadfast and doing good stuff and evolving. And eventually the hard time disappears and you find yourself painting with the guys that you thought you hated 2 years ago.
So, did you, were there people that you would, like any idols of yours while you were painting the trains that you ran into in the yard ever? Like, is that a thing that happened kind of often, where you run into other writers?
I saw Is the Wiz, but I was super young, and at 14, he was a grown man, and I really wasn't interested in meeting anyone in a dark tunnel at 14 years old.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, there were a lot of brushes with guys, and then not Is per se, but the truth is a vast majority of my first encounters with my favorite graffiti writers were all very disappointing.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
I literally started writing around the time that Style Wars came out. That's when I was writing trains. So there was some degree of overlap. While I was painting, some of the guys from Style Wars were still writing, but a lot of them were on their way out. And I think that the film does an amazing job of giving you a reasonable idea of the temperature here in New York, or the climate. And it was sort of hyper aggressive. Like everyone's kind of beefing about cap, but that generation passed the baton on to my generation. And it wasn't a very user-friendly culture growing up. It was pretty aggressive. And, we were a community of kids that didn't have a lot. And I think for so many, graffiti was everything, right? Or their identity, or who they became. And it's why it was so important to so many of us. But it wasn't a very user-friendly culture. I'm lucky that by the time I was 17, I started to grow and put on some weight, and was probably in a better position to defend myself and assert myself, or stand up for myself. Yeah. And then Tretch had a mustache and beard in junior high school. Like my bad joke was that they brought aftershave to his baby shower, but he had a beard forever and he just looked much older than he was. And then my partner Dape was pretty big, so we didn't have a hard time after we kind of grew into being teenagers. So but it's a vocation, and it's youthful traditions are handed down from one young generation to the next. So we were sort of mirroring the hard time that the older guys gave us when we got a little bit older. But I think it's part of the practice and part of the culture.
Yeah, totally. So fast forwarding a little bit, and we're about to start talking about the source and your time there, but I'm kind of wondering, right as you're starting your job at the source and going to work for this magazine, you're a pretty active writer at this point in your life. And you're about to go work at a place where you have an address and people could theoretically come find you pretty easily, or your name was on a bunch of stuff. Did that worry you? Was that a concern when you were looking at that job?
Well, initially it didn't. And then, when Giuliani came into office, it became a terrifying situation suddenly, because historically, graffiti writers just didn't have police showing up at their door with warrants. And there have been quality of life offenses since the dawn of time. But Giuliani was the first mayor to aggressively prosecute people for quality of life offenses.
Right.
And there are a ton of graffiti writers, and I think maybe Steve Powers is probably one of the bigger cases where, you know, they showed up at his house with a warrant because I think he poked fun of Giuliani on a podcast or radio show. And they showed up with a team, and I think they left with 5.5 garbage bags full of stuff. And I think really it's a pretty frivolous lawsuit, but they tie you up in litigation so long that it sort of limits your ability to do the things that you might want to do until that case is over.
Mhm.
But there were all sorts of people that were tied up in litigation and had their houses raided. And I was nervous because I was maybe promoting this activity that they were so anti and giving them a spotlight for what they were doing. And Carl Weston had his issues with Vandal Squad, and there were a lot of people that were sort of in the public spotlight that were arrested or had their homes raided. So it was a legitimate concern. And the Vandal Squad pulled me over one day and harassed me in front of, there was a wall being painted in Soho. Mode 2 was there, Reese, AOK, Noah, TFP, and a handful of other graffiti guys, Delta from the Netherlands. And Vandal Squad recognized me and pulled up and decided to harass me. And had they not been so concerned with embarrassing me in front of everybody, they probably would have had a legitimate collar, but they decided not to look in my trunk or go too far into my knapsack. So yeah, but I got a little bit of slack, and I was always nervous, and I did have an attorney on speed dial at the time, like just in case something happened. But it was terrifying because I did have a physical address in the magazine, and I knew that it wouldn't be too hard. I didn't always use my real name, but I cited myself as a contributor on a monthly basis. So I thought that was something they could easily figure out and tie it to the fact that I probably had a previous encounter for graffiti or two on my record. So it wouldn't have been too hard to figure out if they really started to poke around. But I don't know how interested they were. It was a legitimate concern, though. And then we went out bombing with Fat Joe and KRS one night. And probably not the most advisable thing to do is go out and write graffiti and then write a story about it.
Right.
Documentary legal behavior. But thankfully nothing came of that.
Wow. That's amazing. Can you, okay, let's see. So you have a Graf Flix page. Do you want to talk about the Graf Flix page and kind of like how you inherited it, or like a little bit about Graf Flix versus Unsigned Hype, or like the page you were on kind of thing?
So I was sharing so originally how it started was I had friends that worked at the Source magazine. My good friend Rob Tulo, who I was with last night, I had dinner with him and Greg actually. My subscription to Mischief co-curator, our submission. It's a subscription to Mischief co-curator Greg Lamarche. But but Rob Tulo worked at the Source. We were friends. He went to high school with Greg. Had known him some time, and I knew some of the people on staff. And they ran some graffiti one month, and there were a couple of typos in there. And there was an SR piece in there who I was a big fan of. He was from the A-Line, SR, TNS, TNV, SR, TLS. And they miscredited a couple of the guys. And I just mentioned, like, if you need help with this, just let me know. And they were just like, why don't you do the next month's issue? So the Graf Flix logo that we're looking at there was created by my buddy Bones Malone. He's been in a bunch of films. He had a column in Vibe magazine. He was an A&R at Island Records. He signed the Mobb Deep to their first record deal. And they produced Juvenile Hell. And then Bones has been in Shaft, White Boys, and a million other movies. But Bones was a part of the Mind Squad. He created that Graf Flix logo originally. And they offered me the column, but I was splitting a page with Unsigned Hype at the time. And Unsigned Hype is where Eminem and Common and Wu-Tang and Big's Demo and all sorts of interesting music came through Unsigned Hype. So we were splitting a page for a short while. Maddie, I think, Mateo, or you can see Maddie C next to the bomb there. That's Biggie shouts out peace to Mateo. So that's Maddie. And Maddie signed Mobb Deep, worked with Wu-Tang, Loud, Davina, Exhibit, Wild Cowboys, Big Pun, The Licks, and so on and so forth. But Maddie was doing Unsigned Hype. And then I guess an umbrella group did a survey, and they discovered that Graf Flix was one of the few areas in the magazine that was circulating sales outside of their target demographic, which was, I believe, 13 to 35-year-old male. And we had 40-year-old men that were buying the issue so that they could see a Tracy 168 piece. Speaking of Tracy, rest in peace, Tracy 168. Or it was one of the few publications that they can find at Hudson News or at maybe a Blockbuster that had a phase 2 piece or a blade top to bottom or something really cool. So we were reaching people that weren't into hip hop. They were guys that were into rave and hardcore music and punk. And it was the only regional publication in certain areas that was bringing the monthly graffiti.
Yeah.
So
I remember you talking about circulation at one point, and just having collected a lot of graffiti magazines and started to learn a lot more about them through the exhibition we did with Greg. But the circulation for something like The Source versus a graffiti magazine is incredible. So I think the reach, obviously you've talked about this before, but the reach you had to show graffiti to the world is pretty amazing in that way.
yeah, it was upwards of, I mean, I think that the numbers are based on the notion that per issue, at least 4 people will see that issue or put their hands on it, but they were reaching roughly 4 million people an issue at the height of their popularity. And we were getting mail from around the globe. I mean, it wasn't the best mail and it wasn't the greatest quality stuff, but you can undeniably see the evolution of things. And I would run, maybe it's a Lumit piece or a dime piece. And then for the next 6 months, we get what I would call Lumit Junior or Dime Junior, where everyone in the interesting pockets of the world are trying to do these advanced 3D outlines suddenly. And
Yeah.
but I was seeing the influence that it was having. There were people that were just straight up copying what I was posting, trying to paint it regionally and then mailing it back to me. And it was all very interesting, but I understood that they were in different stages of their development in their region of the world. But absolutely fascinating. I was getting mail from Guam and like really odd pockets of Africa and Asia, and there were a lot of people that were in the military that were subscribing. They subscription holders that were writing me from these really strange pockets where their military bases were around the globe. But there was a great influx of mail, but most of the quality content was really sort of secured behind the scenes. And it was very difficult in the beginning getting photos. Just for context, this was 30 years ago now that this started. September 2023 was my Graf Flix 30th anniversary. And the culture probably wasn't as groomed as it is today. So I was approaching people for photos that they've had in storage and in shoe boxes and under their beds or in the back of their closets for 30 or 20 plus years. And what do you want to do with my pictures? And then do you have a budget? And there were these awkward conversations. But as soon as people started seeing their contemporaries in the pages, the phone would ring or I'd get a letter from somebody. Why did you use him? And I was like, well, he gave me content and you tried to charge me. And well, come over. I've got a box of photos for you. And I think, that's really where the ball started to roll, was when people saw their contemporaries. It sort of suggested that people will either support you because they believe in what you do, or they refuse to be one-upped by somebody that one-upped them in junior high school or high school. So if he's in there, I have to be in there now. And that was really a way of getting really amazing content without even realizing it. So, and it just suggested that people are still competitive this many years later.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about some of these older heads that are giving you access to these incredible collections of photos and stuff. Did you have a really specific anything you were specifically planning to show old New York stuff or newer contemporary stuff, or kind of mix it up? Did you have a plan there?
There wasn't a plan, but every now and again, someone would see something in a magazine. How come he's in there? Well, he met with me and he brought over some cool photos. And then someone shows up with like boxes of stuff for me to go through, right? Take what you need. I'll just make copies. And then I'm like, this is so amazing. I have to run this. And then that would probably bump the stuff that I planned on using the next month. You know,
Mhm.
working in print, I know that time constraints and space constraints will prevent you from doing everything that you want to do.
Mhm.
So in one particular page or book or project. So the idea was like, okay, I've got content for next month now or the next month. But yeah, I was just very fortunate, you know, like I think Blade was one of the people that was really super helpful, is that he had such an amazing archive of photos. And more importantly, I mean, I don't know if this is factual, but dude is like a mega savant. Like he would just tell you not just what they were doing the night they painted it, but he remembered the digit at the top of the train and who was on the other side of the car and the temperature that evening and how they snuck into Esplanade and with their Martin paint and how he got these two Cascade Greens that were left over and gave him the peanut. And they were these fascinating stories that were still accessible, like in the front of his thinking, but the amount of detail that he'd remember things in was like really impressive. And his ability to just go through these boxes of, he had 5,000 photos and albums, and he knew where everything was and when it was done. But that was super helpful. The floodgates kind of opened up once he was kind of welcomed me into his home and donated from his collection.
Mhm.
And
Wow.
this Doc TC5 page was probably the first artist profile page that we did.
Wow. Cool.
Typically, we would try and mix it up and just use assortment of either I would try and keep it consistent. If they were current murals, they were current murals. If they were trains, they were trains. And with an artist profile, we would just try and mix it up a bit. But Doc was one of the first guys I met, maybe when I was about 13, 14 years old, that wasn't an asshole to me, pardon my French. And
Awesome.
we're friends till this day, but he was actually very respectful and super talented and you know, just a fan. And it's a really interesting turning point, like enjoying work and then being able to maybe 20, 30 years later shine the light on the stuff that you thought that was dope growing up and share the things that you love with a larger audience. So yeah, but Doc was the first artist to get an artist profile page in the source. And
That's
the
dope.
page evolved from a quarter page in the magazine to a full page, and then eventually into a 2-page spread, and then finally into its own section, Bomb Shelter, where we were able to write reviews. Maybe it was us reviewing The Art of Getting Over, or doing a feature on Eric and Spar at 149th Street, or if when Mayer designed the BET Awards. So we finally had a space in popular culture where we were able to prioritize some of the breaking news in the graffiti community and share that with the rest of the world in a magazine that was available at your local newsstand, which was super important because there hadn't been anything quite like that. And I firmly believe that based on what we were doing at the source, Blaze magazine and Stress, and then Mass Appeal, all sort necessary. Mass Appeal actually started out as a graffiti magazine, but most of the hip hop magazines moving forward decided to include graffiti as a necessary element while covering hip hop culture. So, but you could find it in Rap Pages and a ton of other magazines. But I think that we were probably, if not the first, maybe one of the first, but probably the one with the broadest audience. Or
yeah, clearly the biggest impact out there, the easiest impact kind of thing. I noticed the Graf Flix logo change in here. I just wanted to call it out if you wanted to call it out.
Yeah, that's the 8-ball or the meatball logo, but that's designed by Greg Lamarche. And I've got an interesting working relationship with Greg. Not only has he been my friend for a better part of the last almost 40 years now, but he designed the Graf Flix logo for me. Later in life, Peacebook Reloaded, and World Peacebook logos, the ABCs of Styles logo, our Rite of Passage logo for our Rite of Passage show at the Red Bull Studios. So he's got a 30-year history of making my branding look really good. But this is a logo that Greg designed. Oddly enough, I just cleaned it up in Illustrator and we'll be making t-shirts and pins as a celebration for our 30th anniversary Graf Flix. So everyone's celebrating 50, and I'm celebrating Graf Flix 30 this year. So
that's awesome. Yeah, so you're highlighting some classic hip hop stuff and hip hop at 50 years. And it kind of sounds like you were already probably pretty involved in hip hop, or knew a bunch of people involved in like the hip hop scene prior to working at the Source. And I know you're a big collector of stuff like that. So do you want to talk a little bit about your hip hop background, or how you grew up with it?
Like most New Yorkers, like grew up with rap music in the background, actually disco in the beginning, and then the early days of rap, like all of the earliest King Tim the Third and Spoonie G and, you know, Rapper's Delight. And so I was fortunate enough that I had cousins that were just maybe 3 years older than me that had access to this in high school when I was in the 6th grade. So I kind of grew up with hip hop and rap. It was sort of the soundtrack to my life at this point. Yeah, my partner Blass won the new music seminar at some point. He was like, honestly, he's like the Forrest Gump of like hip hop. You know, he was a black belt. He had a motorcycle. Like he could skate. He was in a dancing roller skating crew. He could break dance. Like, dude was a black belt, had trophy for handball, and then of course, you know, we'd go writing, and then I'd be like, what'd you do last night? He's like, I don't know. And then he's like, oh, you know what? I was backup dancing for Dougie Fresh last night. And I'd be like, there's no way this dude was at Union Square backup dancing for Doug. And this is at the height of like the show. Like we're writing graffiti while the show is like huge. It's enormous at the time. And I didn't realize that Sean Conrad had a rap career that he was working on. But he won the new music seminar. His DJ Miz won the DJ competition, and they got a deal on Tommy Boy, Freshco and Miz. Wow. But that was my graffiti partner. And then, you know, brushes with things. My buddy Blake Keogh was Lord Scotch. He would rap. See him in the bathroom of high school. Biz Markie was widely believed to have gone to school with me until Big Daddy Kane set me straight recently. But I went to high school with Big Daddy Kane, went to high school with who I believe to be Biz. And then if you've watched Sasha's film, All Up in the Biz, Rakim firmly believed that Biz went to high school with him too. It turns out that Biz went to neither one of our high schools. He lived in a relative proximity to both schools when he was in Wyandanch. I guess he lived near Rakim school, and when he was in Brooklyn, he lived near my zone school at the time. But he hung out in the lunchroom a lot, and you know, Biz would do art and noise, and like all sorts of random beatbox routines in the lunchroom, and he was sort of a staple in my high school. He hung out at my buddy Jamie's house and would play Atari there all the time. And him and Blake were, but there was a lot of rap was around us, sort of like everywhere we kind of went growing up. I mean, I grew up in a city during, I think, the height of, or the evolution of it. So it was pretty common. And then I knew most of the DJs of the parties I went to, and most of the folk. It was sort of like if you were kind of making noise in that space, there was some overlap. People knew who was who. So, and then I stand out in a crowded room. It's hard for me to blend in. So I was easily identified and knew a lot of the folks that were doing cool things, I guess, growing up.
And then you're working at the Source, big.
And I will say that I was working at the Source when it was arguably the best time to work at the Source.
Right.
I was such a fan of everything coming out. You know, this is before the internet, so we would get albums to review, and I'd have like the Nas album, you know, Illmatic, like 12 months before it's commercially available. And I still have Biggie's demo because Big had given me a copy of it. We would get music, and this is before pre-Napster. I know this is so hard to wrap your head around, that for so many young people, that this is before the internet, people leaking music. But the label sent over a physical copy, and then, you know, you had the double cassette deck, and you're like, yo, let me just get a copy of it. So I have so much music that's not been released. Like I have a second Brand Nubian album with all three of them that will never come out, and just an interesting rendition of Method Man and Mary J. Blige's all that I need over the Real Marvin Gaye beat. and Mad Lion stuff, and a ton of music that will probably never come out that I'm
Wow.
not going to release because it's not my place. But
Yeah.
we talked about the Biggie demo. I still have Big's original demo, which is
Yeah.
pretty fun.
Do you have it handy? Because I remember this happened before in a meeting once, and I was shocked. And so, if you have it nearby, I was going to ask.
I don't have it nearby. I have
That's
the
okay.
lousy JPEG that I sent you.
Oh, that's all good. We don't need to.
But on the cassette, which is pretty funny, he gave me his demo, and on the cassette, I didn't know how to spell Biggie Smalls because you couldn't Google him at the time. He just didn't have any music out. So I wrote Big capital E SMALLZ, Biggie Smalls, because I had no idea how to spell his name. And then it ended up in Stretch and Bob's documentary, and they flashed to it. And then at some point, Pete Rock reposts the demo, and the demo's going viral. It has a life of its own outside of me. But every now and again, someone will tag me because Hip Hop DX or like SOHH.com or whatever that website is will just post it in their feed somewhere. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's my cassette. But I still have the original cassette. He's born Curtis Mayfield's like Superfly instead of Marvin Gaye's Give It Up. So there were like really subtle differences in the album because I believe they weren't able to clear samples. But grateful that I held on, very grateful I held on to some of that stuff and held on to a handful of ephemera from hip hop. There was a small window where I had a ton of rap tees and then decided to wear them all. But I do have most of my graffiti t-shirts that were gifted to me. Some of them unworn, a lot of them are unworn, but there are probably storage bins of graffiti tees from the 90s and 2000s. And then I started putting aside rap stickers or promotional rap stickers. Probably made famous by the OPP video or maybe House of Pain Jump Around, where there are stickers being placed in music videos in the early 90s. So I have both of those stickers in my collection unpeeled from circa 1990 and probably have about 3,500 unique unpeeled hip hop stickers from maybe 90 to 2000. So, you know, various Wu-Tang stickers, 12 by 12, Jay-Z Reasonable Doubt, 12 by 12, Mobb Deep, Infamous, 11.5 by 17 Wu-Tang, Raekwon built for Cuban Links stickers. And but we're working on a book right now and working on it with my good friend Brett Rollins. And we're trying to get that hopefully out to print by the end of the year. But yeah, I have small interesting collections. And I think for me, the thinking was if this looks really dope today, imagine how cool this might be 10, 15, 20 years from now. And if it didn't take up too much space, it found its way into some sort of container or shelf or under the bed or in the back of the closet for a little while. And now it's been sort of upgraded into more advanced, safer storage space. But kind of reflecting on the things, I'm sort of grateful I held on to a lot of the things I held on to. I'm not a hoarder. I like to consider myself a calculated pack rat, so it's not quite as hoarder steez, but I have small collections of cool things that are growing.
So, okay, I wanted to gonna shift gears a little bit to this. Might be a convoluted question for a second, so bear with me. You talked a little bit about Dime and Lumet and their kind of sort of impact on sort of style at that point. But I also think you were running a lot of the FX walls and the Tats Crew walls that were happening in New York, and those things also seem like they had a really big impact for being really detailed graffiti pieces, really ornate, super serious background work and photorealism and all kinds of wild stuff. You ran a lot of those in the mag, and those were probably happening, like you were probably going out and getting those pictures, right? Like, and then running it in that current month, correct? Is that like those are happening real time?
So it was happening in real time, but by the time this phenomenon started to occur, people were painting walls, taking photos, and intentionally sending them to me immediately.
Okay.
And they were just like literally like, yo, I'm gonna hand deliver these to you. We just finished this wall over here. And then so there are a couple of things that are really fascinating about this is that quietly, whether or not they'd want to admit it, competition is really what drives innovation. And the guys were looking at each other's work and being like, damn, those dudes crushed it. We got to come back and do something twice as dope. And, dare I say that I'm going to put FX, Tats Crew, FC, and then there are some other collectives. But those were probably the three that were at the forefront of doing really dope stuff. They had absolutely raised the bar,
Right.
Historically, people were painting just small sections of handball courts, maybe a 8-foot wide by 4.5 feet tall chunk of handball court. And then there was all of this negative space. And, to Lee Quinonez's credit, some of those early handball courts, the graffiti 1999, the wall with the lion on it, the Howard the Duck wall, that was arguably the first handball court where somebody looked at it and said, I'm going to paint this entire thing. I mean, Lee was an absolute visionary. He was the first man to look at an entire train and be like, I'm going to paint the whole train. And it's chronicled in Craig Castleman's Getting Up, and Richard Goldstein wrote a story about it for the Village Voice, and you can still find holiday photos on the internet every Christmas, typically. But they really raised the bar by like looking at the entire wall and being like, we're going to do these elaborate theme walls. And it was sort of forcing the other crews to do cool shit, and it was forcing them to send me the photos immediately. And it was a real system. People understood how to take uniform photos, that they had to wait for the sun to shift so that they weren't shooting into the sun. So there was a real process happening, and, following a straight line in front of the wall and getting these perfectly symmetrical photos and fusing them together without Photoshop. And there's tape on the back of all of these photos. Sometimes there are 16 photos that make up the entire mural, and they're all perfectly even. So I wouldn't really touch photos. Sometimes I would tastefully Photoshop out a pole or a sign or just shift some things, but I wouldn't touch the work. But they were doing a remarkable job. They sort of set the standard for, I think, graffiti culture moving forward. Like what was happening here in New York was, it was pretty huge, but they were super competitive. And, rest in peace to Per, this Statue of Liberty wall here, and then the Three Horsemen of the Apocalypse just beneath it.
Yeah.
Every time Per posted that to his Instagram account, one of those two walls, the sheer amount of people that would weigh in and write, I still remember seeing this for the first time in the source. That was 30 years ago. And I think it was absolutely remarkable that so many people are like, I still remember where I was when I saw this for the first time. That this image that I shared in the back of a magazine 30 years ago was still accessible and in front of so many people's thinking, and was so pivotal or influential to people. But similarly, I guess I still remember when I saw the Dondi top to bottom pull-in that's on the wall somewhere behind me. Like I remember seeing that at the platform, and what a grand moment that was. And in a very strange way, I guess this is their equivalent, was that they saw something that was just phenomenal 30-something years ago that's still so accessible. But yeah, it was absolutely touching that I was like, wow, so many people remember this from the source, and that was literally 30 years ago. So but yeah, they were doing amazing work, and the irony and that they're still painting. I mean,
it's they're still doing amazing walls, like on the same caliber. They've been doing it this whole time.
FC just did the 40th anniversary FC wall in Hackensack, New Jersey, which is pretty phenomenal. And folks came in from Japan and London and Los Angeles and Portland and all sorts of different states, and it's phenomenal. So first large-scale production wall I've been excited to see in a long, long time.
Right. Yeah. So I have this, if you're sort of creating this, you're giving a lot of this stuff shine and letting it get seen by millions of people, and the circulation is out there. So these are getting out to a ton of graffiti writers or sort of like aspiring graffiti writers. Does it feel interesting or weird now to think about like the impact of showing super detailed work, and maybe a generation of writers got really into detailed work and maybe got less good at letters as they got better at detail specific things, or do you have any feelings about the stuff that you showed through the magazine and its impact on the scene or the styles that came up later?
No, I think it was a well-rounded sort of blend of things. Like we weren't running modern murals every month. You know, we might take a break the following month and use a Crime 79 train or you know, something on the A&C train or an Is the Wiz car or something like that. So we were kind of mixing up the content a bit, which was important. And you know, subway art, Style Wars, and most of the films and books that came out, a lot of it came out during the same window, which was probably pre-1984. And it's a very narrow view of what was actually happening here in New York. You know, in Subway Art, for instance, which I absolutely love. I think it's a phenomenal book, but there are very few letter trains in there. I mean, dare I say that the the Kane Memorial car is in Astoria, that's on the double R. And the Is the Wiz Hell is for Children is the CC flat and the D yard. And I could be wrong, but those are probably two of the letter trains that are the standout trains in that entire book. And most of the stuff that we were looking at were on the 2s and the 5s, the IRT line, the 1 line. So there's a whole section of New York City Transit that didn't get shined. So I was slowly but slowly shining the light on some of the people that might have missed the spotlight. There were so many people that were important to the conversation that just sort of didn't get any shine because Martha and Henry had better vantage points to shoot outdoor subways on the IRT line. Not all of the letter trains go outdoors and they aren't great vantage points. And then I think maybe the quality of work that was produced was a little bit different as well. But so I was sort of kind of shining the light on the community of unsung heroes at the same time. But it was interesting. People were like learning from what they were seeing in the magazine and not really going out and practicing. And I think that there's an evolution, is that your signature gets good and then you try a throw up and your throw up gets good, and then you evolve into doing pieces, and then the pieces become a little bit more intricate or a little bit more elaborate or detailed or sophisticated. And there's an evolution, and people were jumping past needing a signature and needing a throw up, and they were just doing pieces, and they evolved into doing burners. But most of these people still don't have a decent signature and can't do a throw up because they're not in a situation where they might have to get up quick. They grew up as muralists or aerosol artists or painters, which is a very different experience than mine, having written traditional graffiti for the first, you know, stretch of my my creative journey.
I just threw this slide on to highlight some of the people you're getting mail from, because this is a pretty great range right here.
And you know, just also, not to, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that now I get to bump into people. You know, you don't really understand the impact of what you're doing in the moment. But I've traveled the world, and from travel and from being identifiable in a crowded space and maybe sort of still looking, people approach me like, "You Chino?" And I'm like, "Yes." And then, you know, I started writing at 13 because of your column, and now I'm a creative director here. And there's a working community of creative adults that had a spark lit in them from something they discovered in the back of the Source magazine a lifetime ago. And it's really fascinating that I get to meet so many of those people that were inspired to write graffiti from something I shared. And that's pretty powerful. As I bump into all of these people that are doing amazing things as far as creativity. They're creative directors and animators and tattoo artists and apparel designers and interior designers and programmers, but they're doing really cool things, and their creative journey sort of started with something I shared in the back of a magazine. And then you showed just a little while ago that page with Cause and Steve Powers and, you know,
Catch too.
Catch. And really interesting that, you know, I mean, nowadays I don't think that Cause needs to mail in photos to be considered, but this is probably some of the earliest work he may have had in mainstream print. I thought the stuff was super cool. I love the billboards that he was doing, and that top to bottom. I've got a couple of different outtakes. There's a photo of him on the top of the train. This was probably some of his earliest mainstream print stuff, and I still have a couple of handwritten letters from him from back in the day. Don't know how many of those he has to write these days, but really fascinating that I saw value in so much of this stuff 30 years ago. And, you know, it took the rest of the world a little while, but eventually they all caught on. You know, there are guys that were in the pages of the source, Todd James, Steve Powers, Jose Parla, Cause, and Greg Lamarche, and a community of other people that are doing really amazing things today. They're still working creatives. So
yeah,
having always saw value in it, and grateful that the rest of the world sees value in what they're doing.
And moving a little bit off of this, and we gotta I guess I gotta start wrapping up in a little bit, but I was gonna show a few other magazines that are not yours necessarily, so things like On the Go or G-Cell, but I was gonna highlight that you were kind of in the middle of this scene of 90s graffiti magazines, and there's a huge scene happening, and your column in the source has definitely the biggest circulation by a lot, but you were also operating within this community. Can you talk about some of the mags that you liked, or that you knew people at, or that you were interested in? Were you trading mags and stuff too?
I really was terrible at trading because of the volume of mail I got, made it a little difficult, but I appreciated it. I did stay in touch with a lot of folks. Most people that had graffiti magazines were mailing them to the source just so that I could be aware of what they were doing in their scene regionally.
Cool.
Yeah. You know, loved what Steve was doing it On the Go. Really liked Magic Moments. I thought the aesthetic design and the choices of their picks were really sound. Obviously, the first thing that ever really resonated with me was Phase 2 Dave Schmidlab. Why am I drawing
IGT?
IGT was obviously the first. But what Loved Life Sucks Dies. I thought those dudes were hilarious.
Me
and
too,
then Sam played basketball with us for years, and maybe 8 years into knowing him, he's like, I used to send you magazines. And I was like, why would you do that? I had no idea he worked at the magazine for so long. But thought that they were hilarious. Loved what Steve did with On the Go. Enjoyed Mass Appeal. And then what is the English magazine? I'm sorry, I'm drawing so many blanks right now.
Is that Underground Productions maybe? Or no, that's not English.
They did the Thicker Spine, Graphotism. And I thought they did a really good aesthetic design of designing a magazine. Like you could see where Quark Express and the advent of desktop publishing sort of changed the face of printed matter. People weren't cutting things out anymore. They had these long slots to put in photos in Quark Express, but they kind of had a professional feel to the magazine, and I enjoyed the aesthetic design. I enjoyed watching the magazines evolve. So I thought that they were doing a good job. And then right here as well. Yeah, these guys did a great job. And then the content, and you know, when you venture into a new region of the world, it's like walking into the woods and turning over a log or a stone, and you find this like thriving community of like things that you didn't know existed here. And you know, I mean, this is probably a lot of stuff, you know, Bates is from Copenhagen, and Renz, and these guys were crushing shit back then. But I didn't have access to this stuff living in the States. So this was all super insightful, and yeah, learned a lot. But these were some of my favorite magazines. Definitely Underground Productions. They did a great job as well.
Yeah. Something real quick. Okay, this is a slightly selfish question, but hopefully it's helpful. We're at Letterform Archive. We're putting together a collection of graffiti stuff. We're mostly focusing on magazines and books, and some zines and some stickers and a few sketches and things. If you were starting a collection of graffiti stuff that you were trying to hold on to forever, what would you be starting with? Well, what things would you want to like have in that collection for sure?
I guess some of the early IGTs would be important. Junk Waffle, just because it was so wildly inspirational. Like Bodie and Cheech Wizard were like such staples in the culture. Like I wanted to figure out who that dude was with the yellow hat and the stars. I didn't know why everyone was drawing him when I was a little kid. And it ended up with some of the coolest productions, and the Lizard and the Bodie Broads still are so aesthetically dope to me, even this many years later. Like they haven't gotten tired. But I don't even know what's available. I wouldn't even know how to do an archaeological dig going that far back.
Yeah,
But Skills Magazine, super impressive. Greg did a fantastic job.
absolutely.
Some of the earlier mass appeal issues were dope. And then their books, you know, ton of books. I mean, Craig Castleman's Getting Up, I think, is sort of necessary required reading. It's such a great book, and it sort of predates this era or the publishing explosion that happened in the 2000s.
Hmm.
And then if you can source old news articles, you know,
Yeah,
that issue of Esquire, or, you know, if you can find the Times with the Taki interview, but trying to find, you know, artifacts sort of like that, I think would be fun to have in a collection. But I wouldn't even know how to go back in time and figure out where to source this stuff today. I haven't
yeah.
online. I know there are communities of people trading things right now.
Hmm.
I wouldn't know where to start. I mean, I have so much of it, and I
Yeah,
still held on to all of the graffiti magazines that were mailed to me. I've got plastic bins full.
dang, that's awesome. Okay, well, kind of starting to wrap up here. I think as I've talked to you somewhat recently about this stuff, it kind of sounds like you're a little bit of an ambassador of graffiti in a couple of your jobs right now, both with the Beyond the Streets, but also maybe with other things. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you're doing today, what your work looks like today?
Well, today I'm grateful to be in Brooklyn. But for the last year, I think it's been 16 cities in 9 countries. But worked on a show in Winnipeg for Claudia Money back in October. Was in Barcelona for some work. I had a contract with the State Department, worked with a program called Next Level. It's an international diplomacy program. So I was a site manager for mural projects in 3 Middle Eastern cities. So I was in Bahrain in December. It's just outside of Saudi Arabia, and I was with Mast in Ascend, and they painted a 51st Kingdom of Bahrain Day mural, National 51st Kingdom Day of Bahrain in December. Beyond the Streets opened at the Saatchi Gallery in February, so I spent the month of February in London working on that show, produced that show. We had our Letterform Archive show opening in San Francisco in May, so I was there for the first 11 days of May. Was home for 2 days, and then in Israel working on a mural project at Yafa, Tel Aviv, with Alice Mizrahi and Peyton Scott Russell. Visited Jerusalem, hopped the plane to Giza because I needed to see a pyramid. Slept at a hotel just opposite of the Sphinx, climbed the pyramid, rode a camel through the desert, and visited the Giza Pyramid Complex. Jumped the plane to Luxor, Valley of Kings, Karnak. Was in Shanghai for Beyond the Streets. It opened in Shanghai in July. And I painted something for the NBA and Hennessy there. So I was there for the opening of the show. And I just got back from Abu Dhabi for a mural project while the NBA was in Abu Dhabi. Most of the guys were staying at my hotel, and the Timberwolves and the Dallas Mavericks played. And I bumped into my buddy Mike that I worked with at breakfast. He was part of the activation there. And bumped into Sam Perkins. Lives in my neighborhood. What are the chances I'm talking to a dude in Abu Dhabi that I grew up watching on television that lives about 6 blocks from me? But the nicest guy under the sun. So it's been a lot of travel. At the moment, I'm curating something for the American Embassy in Beijing. It's an activation called Art for the People, which will launch in 2024. Trying to finish some books and working on some other really fun projects that I can't quite talk about yet, but super exciting stuff. And probably another trip to the Middle East at some point, waiting to hear back. But I think we're going to Riyadh for something. So a lot of traveling, and grateful that wherever I pull up, I get DMs from people that know who I am, that are following me, that live in these regions of the world. It's absolutely amazing that, like, I'm in London 7:30 in the morning and someone's texting me because they think they saw one of my stickers in their neighborhood. And I'm in Israel and guys are following my stories and like, welcome to Tel Aviv. And I'm like, how do you know I'm here? And they're like, we follow you. We're looking at your stories right now. You're by the beach. So, and same thing in Barcelona, dude sliding up in my DMs like, yo, what's up? You in town? Let's go paint. So absolutely, yeah, super powerful, and grateful that I've been welcomed with open arms in all of these interesting regions. But yeah, whole lot of travel, and I'm grateful. You know, I was a kid that grew up in projects in Brooklyn. Like traveling wasn't something that we had money to do as a child. But I've been around the world and back on so many occasions at this point. So absolutely grateful for this journey, and it's been absolutely fascinating.
So, well, that's super insightful. Thanks. I think we're going to open up for questions in a sec, but I wanted to start one, which is just what advice do you have for younger generations of graffiti writers? Like what do you want to see from that generation? Anything you want to talk on to that? And I'm going to stop sharing this real quick.
You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like people are doing really cool things today, and there's sort of a blueprint for it, you know, but obviously do what you love what you do it with integrity, set a standard for yourself, continue to evolve, and just do good stuff. And that's what people will associate you with, is just doing good stuff, you know? And then people always ask, how do I transition from my 9 to 5 into a full-time creative? And really, you have to do the things you have to do in order to do the things that you want to do, right? So you go to your 9 to 5, and then from 5 until you pass out, you chase your passion. And if you evolve and you do good work, you'll eventually start replacing your 9 to 5 with the stuff that you were doing from 6 till you fall asleep, and you can gradually transition from one space to another. But just, you know, keep your antennas up. I wasn't an academic. I didn't go to school for anything. It was really sitting with people who did dope things. It was the Say Adamses of the world, and the, you know, Steve Powers and the Dana Jameses and the Roger Gassmans and the Sasha Jenkinses, and all of these interesting creative people that I had a good fortune of being able to work with, the Chimo Dews and the Chris Callaways and the Ola Kudus, and all of these people that did amazing things that took a minute. So like Adrian Vargas, rest in peace, and all of these interesting creative people that took time out to teach me something. Like, if you want to live with me forever, just teach me something useful. That's all. And I will honor you every time I do it, and I'll shout you every time I put someone else onto it. But really, like, I was just very fortunate. You know, I've been a fly on the wall in so many interesting creative spaces, and I don't think anyone knows that I was just sitting there taking notes the entire time, quiet. So, you know, just, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The information's there. Surround yourself with good people that are doing it, and you'll be one of those good people doing it in no time.
And like you said before, you apprenticed into this thing, you know, like that's part of it too, I think.
Yeah, I knew that I've always known that I don't know much or everything, and that there's still a lot to learn, and no matter what I'm doing. So I'm a perpetual student and grateful. I actually enjoy learning, so that's a good thing for me, is that I feel like I'm continuing to grow, which is important. But just honestly, just being able to do what you love. And, you know, like, it gets a little bit frustrating at times with an overwhelming schedule and overlapping deadlines. But I remind myself constantly, I asked for this, and geez, I see what people have to do sometimes, and I'm in no position to ever complain. Like, I love what I get to do. So
cool. Well, that's all the questions I have. Are there some? I haven't seen any questions in the Q&A yet. Kate, do you have any questions popping in?
Yeah, Dave, so great to see you. Thanks for being with us today. Kel, thank you so much.
Good to see you.
While we are waiting for people to type questions they might have in the chat or the Q&A, I did have at least one or two for you. And Kel, I'm wondering if you can throw up Sasha Jenkins's magazine on the screen again real fast. So one of the things you talked about working at the source was that you had an incredible distribution. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what that provided you in your experience working on a magazine that's different than maybe some of the other zines that were coming out at that time. And I think Sasha's is a good example of this. We see this pretty DIY kind of type mixed with hand lettering, kind of photocopied feel, which is really different than the glossy high production one you have. Can you speak to that a little bit for us?
Sure. This is 100% DIY, and this is where it started. And it was really easy to accept because it was walked into the game this way. And this is how I was familiar with zines through IGT and some of the earliest zines. The truth of the matter is, to some degree, I'm probably a bit OCD, and I enjoy printed matter, and I enjoy the uniformed nature of it and how clean it is. but working at the source gave me a greater appreciation for good photography and lighting and composition, and there were kerning, and like there are all sorts of small things that are like involved in print that are important to me, and even horizon lines or horizontal lines being straight in the back, and there are all sorts of things that drive me nuts about print. So I clean things up, but I enjoy the process and love putting together printed matter. But this is it. This is where it started, and I absolutely loved where it was then. And then it feels as the culture grew up and I grew up, my taste became a little bit more, not necessarily sophisticated, but I enjoyed the printed matter portion. When it evolved into that space, it's almost like I'm okay with the fan until I get central AC, or I'm okay with this dial-up until I've discovered DSL, right? And then all of a sudden you're like, I don't know if I can go back now that I've had a taste of this. But this is the stuff that I fell in love with initially, and you know, you only get a chance to experience something once for the first time, and there were so many gems that were buried in these magazines, and you were just like, oh wow, this is amazing. But now I can appreciate it in the glossy form and high-res scan version of it, and nicer printed matter. But yeah, this is the stuff that I love this stuff in the beginning, and then I think as the years went on, my taste sort of evolved, and you know, I can still appreciate the zine, but a part of me really enjoys glossy, full color printed matter.
Yeah. I mean, Sasha's clearly using like scissors and probably tape or paste here. What kind of tools we're using? We're using cork. I heard you call out Cork Express earlier.
That was like sort of industry standard at the time, and the content was on a SideQuest. The disc was like a sizable disc that it was stored on, and because Graf Flix was the most colorful page in the entire magazine, it had to go to print first for color separations, just to make sure that they were getting the color right. So I've got countless proofs of the page before it was actually a page. And then, you know, small notes on how to adjust, you know, CMKY or whatever it is, adjust this by 80% or tweak that by 20. So I still have a lot of those proofs, but it was a complicated page to put together during the early days of production. And then eventually it was like, just send this when you have it. But they would send a messenger over to pick the stuff up, or I'd have to bring it into the office. And then there just became a window where we could drop box it, or a messenger would show up and just take the burned CD from me or the USB flash drive from me, which was very different. And that was super easy. But I enjoyed going into the office. There were always treats like promotional t-shirts and party passes and all of these things where you're like, oh yeah, I need to come up here more often, just because there were a lot of perks involved at working at the source, in addition to just working there. Like, probably had been to some of the greatest hip-hop shows and parties, and it was the best time to work in that environment. I don't have it in me today to go to parties. I'm probably asleep by the time most parties start.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for that. I have one more question, and then I see we have one from E as well. My other question was, you talked a little bit about the just quantity of mail that you got, and also now that you have people sliding in your DMs, now that the internet exists, so things like Instagram. Being in touch with people through written form, whether that's letters back in the day or a quick text message now, has always been really central to this community and how it connects with each other. Aside from speed, how do you think the introduction of the internet has changed that for you?
It's fascinating. So in the last maybe year or so, there's been this reoccurring theme where I get tagged to things from artists in Africa. And it's really powerful and it's moving. It says, shout out to this man for bringing graffiti to the continent of Africa before we had the internet. And that's absolutely powerful, that like so many people have shared that sentiment with me, is that they had the source long before they had access to dial-up or Wi-Fi. And this is where they were getting their small tastes. And then that's also fascinating meeting Cormega, who was locked up during Nas's One Love. So when Nas asked, what's up with Cormega? Did you see him while y'all together? He was in jail, and he was stealing or cutting out the Graf Flix page and wallpapering his cell with it. And I would meet all of these interesting people that like had a relationship with the content that I was sharing. And again, it was very hard. I mean, not to sound over romanticize the situation, but rarely understand that you're in the middle of making history while it's happening. And there were just so many people that this was their everything. Like it birthed, I guess, the same way Subway Art and Style Wars is responsible for earlier generations' inspiration to be a part of the culture. There were so many people that had that spark lit in them in the back of the magazine at some point. And that's really moving. It's like interesting that I've been able to share something that has moved somebody to a space where they were inspired to do something really cool, and that experience has loaned itself to something that they do that's really cool as an adult now, and that they're really good at something. I talked to Bisco, and like he told me that the Godzilla wall the Tats crew did, he traced that while he was in school. There was a drawing thing, but he's an artist now. And that was, I think, one of the first things that he tried to draw. And there are all of these really fascinating stories from interesting, really talented creatives out there and their relationship with the content that I was sharing. That's pretty fascinating. And I don't even know if I answered your question properly, but yeah, now people get it in real time. It happens in the internet. So, similarly, I don't know if the source would be relevant today. I know they still produce a magazine, but in an era of TMZ, you wouldn't want to wait 31 days or 30 days for a magazine to give you news when you're getting breaking news on the internet daily. So I know that we're communicating in real time across the globe. Something happens and people are talking about it around the world like day of. So, but yeah, it's really powerful. It's a testament to social media and passion and just how driven people are. And I still believe that in spite of there being all of these amazing graffiti things, we're still an underserved community of people, that there's so much more that we sort of still need to sort of satisfy that itch or our desire or our curiosity. And there's so much dope shit going on right now as well. So I think there are endless things that we can point to. But I sort of miss having a platform, but at the same time, I don't miss having the responsibility of having the break this. And it was a great time while I was doing it. And I still bump into people that are like, I was stationed in Japan when I read that Gandhi passed away in the back of the source. And there's all of this really interesting information and people have these stories they've been carrying with them for a better part of the last 30 years. And when they meet me, they have to share this with me. And it's amazing just how passionate people are. And but yeah, overall, it's always good energy, which I'm grateful for.
So it looks like we have one question, and probably that's about all we have time for, I think. So I'll read this one from E. As you started traveling internationally, did you have any major culture shock within the graffiti culture, approaches to painting, styles, etc.?
I've had some interesting moments. I remember being in Thailand, and Cider, who was there, told me that he had put Vaseline on the wall the day before. And I said, why would you do that? He said, well, I was trying to prevent someone from painting over me, but they still painted over me. And I was like, interesting. Okay. And then he had mentioned maybe writing on something and then his hand getting swollen. And I think his belief as a Buddhist was that he had done something wrong and something had occurred to him. And I started learning all of these interesting cultural situations, like Irish folks painting on the Catholic side of the wall and there being bullet holes on it, and the other guys on the Protestant side of the wall, and just these interesting cultural nuances. My friends in Yugoslavia or in Croatia talking about there being an occupation and there being a curfew, and them having to put duct tape on their headlights so that the planes overhead wouldn't see them driving around at night, and them painting during a time of conflict and bombs landing nearby and the ground shaking while they were painting. So there are all of these really fascinating sort of cultural experiences that other folks have had. Would love to do an Anthony Bourdain style graffiti show where we can kind of highlight some of these interesting things. But yeah, every now and again I talk to somebody and I'm absolutely blown away. And then when we worked on World Peace Book, I took it for granted that most people, I just assumed they were people that had to wait until their local library opened up so that they could scan the item and then send me their submission because they didn't have a home computer, they didn't have internet. And that was really fascinating. We got to feature artists from 32 different countries, I believe, and things get lost in communication. I only know how to say high resolution in one language. And 300 DPI doesn't always translate properly. And so there were a lot of interesting sort of learning curves. But yeah, absolutely fascinating, and loved some of the graffiti that was traditional but had a very unique flavor to it. Baker, who was in Turkey at the time, had this sort of Islamic, Arabic sort of flow to it, and Dredder from Johannesburg sort of had this sort of regional flow to it. And some of the stuff that was coming out of China and Taipei had this sort of regional flow to it. And that stuff was kind of dope, is seeing this American art form with these region. It's like cuisine, like their local spices have really made this familiar dish a little bit more exciting today, right? So I sort of love what they did with it. But yeah, those are some of the things. And then just, but at the end of the day, it's like music. You put on music and it's universal. People just dance. And that's sort of the amazing power of art as well, is that in spite of being in regions of the world where we don't speak the same language, we have a passion for the very same activity, craft, or culture, and where they're painting, and you figure it out as you go along. But yeah, it is absolutely fascinating to learn some of these interesting logistical hurdles that people have had to go through. And I think that, me having to sneak out and avoid police is very different than having to avoid a military or other things, or there being wild boar in your train yard. We were worried about getting robbed by older graffiti writers, and the guys in Italy had wild boars running in the yard and armed guards. So yeah, all of these things are really fascinating, but learned a whole lot from different people around the world. Always interesting learning from folks.
So, well, I think we're about out of time, and Chino, thanks so much for doing this and for talking with us. You have any last things to say? Anybody have any last things, Kate?
Appreciate you guys having me. Thank you so much. This was fantastic. Really appreciate you guys taking the time. And if you haven't seen our show, it's up until January. So please pop in. And yeah, and that's really it. But appreciate you guys making the time and having me today. Thank you to anyone and everyone that tuned in today.
Thanks, everybody.
Cool. Take care, guys. Great rest of your day.